So we go from last week being my birthday episode to this week being the anniversary episode of the podcast. 3 years is a long time to do anything. Yeah, I know what you're saying out there. Wait, didn't you take a hiatus for like 6 months? Yes, that is true, but the first episode of the podcast was This Week in History 3 years ago. I'm sure a lot of you out there know the origin story of this podcast. For those of you that are new to the show, I'll kind of sum it up. In the late summer of 2020, I had finally decided to give it a real shot to give up alcohol after having several years of really bad drinking problems. In episode 112, I really took a deep dive into 3 years of sobriety for me, so you can go back to check that out. Anyway, typically when you give up some sort of vice, you need something to fill that hole that is left by it. The most common one is people that give up smoking and then turn to food. Although I'll say I turned to food a lot too after giving up alcohol, I'm not gonna lie. But I needed a distraction, and I thought back to things that brought me joy when I was younger, and creating fake radio programs and variety shows and such with my friends when I was in high school, that was a lot of fun. The natural progression of that was to do a podcast. But the big thing was, what was I going to talk about? And I was very indecisive. I love Cape Cod, New England history. I love travel. I love the 80s and 90s. I love humor. And that seems to manifest itself in a lot of foolish stories from my own life. So I decided to just talk about all of that. I figured at worst, nobody would listen to it, but it would be something to keep my mind occupied, to keep me from thinking about drinking. So at least at the very beginning, this podcast kept me sober. And those of you that listened, especially during the first 6 months to a year of this show, your listening kept me sober. So thank you. I'm kind of laughing about it, but it's reality. And it kept me sober because it's a lot of work to do a podcast if you do it right with care. Once I came up with the subjects I wanted to talk about, I needed to lay it out to kind of structure it so it flowed, because it was going to be a buffet of all these different topics, but you still need the buffet to look nice. I had to come up with a logo, a title. The title was pretty easy. The In My Footsteps came from the idea that nothing I was going to talk about was anything that I hadn't experienced. I guess with the history, that's a little bit different, because a lot of those stories took place before I was born, but I guess I experienced researching it, if you want to get technical. I was lucky with the logo that I have two friends, Barry and Amy, that are graphic design specialists, so they were able to give me some ideas. And just like with the old fake variety show radio shows that I did in high school, I wanted to have all kinds of different music to signify different segments, to create kind of a familiarity for the listeners. So that you know if it's road trip segment time, there's that skid and there's that song entitled Override Drive by a man named Dan Leibovitz, which I got all that music from the YouTube audio library that you can get for free, royalty free. This software that I'm recording the podcast with, Audacity, it takes a little bit of a learning curve, but it's not that hard. And I've had the same Samson Q2U microphone that is kind of the perfect mix of cheap but yet high quality. It's like where the Venn diagram kind of crosses over. Besides the actual topics and researching out enough topics to do the podcast for a good 4 years if I had gotten no new information, my big thing was getting the theme song, something that fit. And that's where I found James River by a man named DJ Williams, again, off of YouTube. It's an excellent song. I have it on my mixes for the gym. I have the link to DJ Williams' website. It's been in the description of the podcast since day one. I like his music so much that when I started doing the Patreon bonus episodes, I found a different song of his to be the theme for that, called The Sound of a Dollar. I spent 6 weeks setting up for that first episode of the podcast to make sure it was right. I even did kind of a mock podcast, a dry run, a short 5-minute podcast based around a character that used to star in a lot of the skits that my friends and I did when we were in high school called Psycho Monkey. If you're not sure what that is, We used this thing called a furry Huggums puppet, and he'd have his own talk show where he would yell at people, and it was very much teenage humor, but I always found it funny, so I created a podcast where he hosted it and just yelled at everyone. He has a very distinct, gravelly voice for the people that know me and know those skits, but for you that don't, he sounds like this. Hello there. Yes, I am hosting my own podcast, and I hate everybody. Yes, I do. That was the podcast with Psycho Monkey Hates Everything. I've noodled with possibly doing a second podcast that's just that craziness, because comedy podcasts are big hits, but I've only got so much room on my plate. So then episode 1 came, and it sounded a bit like this. Hello, world. Hoping that wherever you are, you're having a good morning, a good afternoon, a good evening, whatever you've got. This is the debut episode of the In My Footsteps podcast. I am thrilled that you could join me. My name is Christopher Setterlund. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of an escape from the world. We're going to have a little bit of interesting history tidbits, New England travel, where to go, what to see, when the time is right. A little bit of retro, going back in time, and some more interesting things as we go along. But as I said, this is the debut episode, so it's going to be kind of a work in progress. As I went along, I refined it, and I still am refining it. I added This Week in History, and then a time capsule to that, and then top 5 lists. Now I'm starting to get into segments on reviewing old short film, educational short films. I did it with the Ounce of Prevention video in episode 101 and Snuffy the Talking Fire Engine in episode 114. And I've got other ideas, things that I might pull back on in the future, things that I might dive deeper into in the future. Because when growing and marketing a podcast and trying to eventually monetize it so I can do this as more than a hobby, it's a lot of trial and error and seeing what episodes, what subjects do better with listeners. Because even though I'm 3 years and now 119 episodes in, it's still all new to me. I'm constantly reading articles and watching videos on how to do a better job as a podcast host, how to market it better. That's where the Patreon and Buzzsprout subscriptions came from. The next natural step. A big point I wanted to share with all of you that are listening is that any of you out there can make a podcast. It's not hard. The main thing you need is the time and the commitment and a subject that you enjoy speaking about. Because the vast majority of podcasts that start up, they go under within a few months because of time or poor planning or people choosing a topic that's just not sustainable. But I know so many people in my life, family and friends, that are passionate and knowledgeable about subjects that they could easily do a podcast if they had that desire. If you're thinking about it or have thought about making your own podcast, I hope this inspires you to do it. Because what I'm doing is not special. Yeah, granted, it's a small percentage of podcasters that hit it really big. I'm not looking to become the top 1% of podcasters out there. I'm looking to get to a point where all of my content creation, podcast, books, YouTube videos, etc., become self-sustaining so that that's my only necessary income stream, that I can just do that full time. And that's been my goal since day one, because you've got to have big goals like that, because it gives you something to shoot for to continue to improve and better your craft. For those of you longtime listeners, I know you've heard me talk about this several times before, about how anyone can make a podcast, because it's true. And if any of you are thinking about starting one but don't know where to start or what to do, if you need any advice or anything like that, you can always reach out to me. Like I said, I'm not the top 1% of podcasters, but I'm closer to the top 25%, so that's pretty good based on my numbers. And as we pass 3 years on the podcast, looking ahead towards the next 3, I've definitely got enough material for that, especially as I grow and adapt. I've got ideas where I'm going to take this, but as I go, I wanted to make sure that I thanked everybody who has listened, but also the people that have supported me behind the scenes, family and friends that thought it was a good idea that I do this, those that listen and share. And I hope to all of you out there that you've enjoyed this podcast. Even though it can be somewhat random, I guess, there are lots of topics that I cover, different subjects, but you know they're going to be kind of in that same wheelhouse. New England history, travel, fun lifestyle topics, foolish stories from my own life, 80s, 90s nostalgia, because that's all stuff I know and love. So thank you for being with me on this journey, and here's to the next 3 years of the In My Footsteps podcast.